The murder of 6 million Jews during World War II, most of whom died without the ability to defend themselves, reinforced an already widespread perception of Jews as a physically passive people without a martial culture. The creation of the State of Israel only 3 years after the Holocaust ended, and the importance of the fledgling Israel Defense Forces in assuring the state's initial survival also contributed to the perception that between the events described in the Old Testament and the creation of Israel in 1948, Jews kept themselves at a distance from the military. A new book by historian Derek Penslar entitled Jews and the Military casts a much more complicated light on Jewish history and the role of the military in it. And with that, we welcome on the line from Oxford, UK via Skype, there's Derek Penslar. Now, normally we've got you here in the studio because you're a U of T prof, but what are you doing over there?
Well, I've taken a position here as well as the position at University of Toronto. I'm founding a new program in Israel Studies here, and the University of Toronto has been very kind to give me a little bit of time to do that.
Well, that's great. Congratulations on that, and we're very happy to have you back on the program. Let's start with something that you actually raised towards the end of your book, and that is one of the most contentious issues in Israel has to do with certain sects, S-E-C-T-S, of Orthodox Jews who refuse to serve in the Israeli army. What is their argument for not wanting to be soldiers in a country where everybody, and I mean everybody, men, women, immediately after they're finished high school, are in for mandatory service?
Well, I think it's important to point out what they're not claiming or they're not suffering from. They're not cowards. It's not that at all. It's a very principled belief that in order to serve the Jewish people, in order to serve the God of the Jews, it is incumbent to be a Torah scholar, to live the life of a Torah scholar, and that for the most extremists, I'd say, among what are called Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews, the very notion of a secular state of Israel is itself an abomination, even though I think that the number of Jews who really feel that strongly has decreased markedly in recent years. But there still is this very profound sense that the way to serve Am Yisrael, the way to serve the God of Israel, is for the men to be Torah scholars and not to be soldiers. And so you have incidents where, and this actually has a historical pedigree, where an ultra-Orthodox Jew is willing to use violence, is willing to use force in order to not be drafted or to protest against being drafted.
And they don't see any inconsistency between taking welfare from this illegitimate Jewish state or having other fellow Jews die to protect them? They don't see any inconsistency there.
Well, I think their answer, again, is that they are serving a higher calling. It's that they're not simply taking money and doing nothing in return. Now, there are many secular Israelis and Jews the world over who look upon this view and react the way as you just formulated it. But that's not simply the way they think of it. But again, this is changing of itself, and it's changing slowly. The economic position of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel is one that cannot be sustained, where many of the men do not work. They are gradually, perhaps without any ideological awareness of it, becoming integrated into the state. They're going to become more involved in the workforce, and eventually, although we haven't quite seen the mechanism yet in place, eventually more of them will do some kind of national service. Some of them, actually, a very small number, do serve in the military.
Okay, let's hit this perception on the head, which of course goes back a long way, that somehow Jews are a meek and pacific people with no military history and really, never mind not interested in it, but are fearful about being affiliated with the military. How did that perception get started in the first place?
I think it's actually fairly recent, because what my book tries to show is a kind of a forgotten story, not just the forgotten story of Jews who served literally by the millions in armed forces in the 17, 18, and 1900s, but also the story of the pride that Jews took in that military service for hundreds of years, a way of showing that they were integrated into modern states, that they deserved civil and political rights. I argue in the book that the amnesia, the forgetting of this story, is actually fairly recent. It occurs as a result of the Second World War and the establishment of the State of Israel, because in the wake of the Holocaust, it appeared that the whole notion of Jews volunteering, gladly serving their states, would seem somewhat ludicrous. They had fought for countries which betrayed them, so it seemed. And with the establishment of the State of Israel, Jewish pride in military affairs could be really focused on this one small country and the story of its war of 1948 and its subsequent wars. So the military spirit, which I think has existed in Jewish culture, certainly in the Western world since the early 19th century, has been channeled in the last 65, 67, and 8 years into the State of Israel.
You write in the book, it is impossible to understand the origins of Israel's military, one of the hallmarks of the Jewish state, without probing the history of the relationship between Jews and the use of armed force in modern times. The Zionist project aspired to create a new Jewish warrior on the soil of the Jews' ancient biblical homeland. Yet the course of an entire civilization cannot be changed in a generation or two. Just be a little more specific. Help us out understanding what it is that you're referring to that can't be changed in a generation or two.
Well, civilizations are massive structures, and they consist of religion, and there's political systems, and there's economic structures. There's so much that defines a civilization. And Jews had developed certain ways of behaving, of working, of acting for centuries. And the Zionist revolution was also in many ways preserving aspects of the Jewish past. Jewish political behavior, economic behavior, much of it brought into the State of Israel despite all of the changes that occurred. And the same thing is true for the military, that many Jews who came to the land of Israel before it was the state had in fact served in armies in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in various countries in the Jewish diaspora. Many of the founders of the Israel Defense Force themselves had this kind of military experience. So it's not a kind of a clean rupture between diaspora and the State of Israel. There are areas of continuity between the two.
You also refer in the book almost to the very beginning of Judaism. You go back to Abraham's grandchildren, Jacob and Esau, who are the, I guess, Jacob the brainiac, Esau the warrior. I mean, those are the two archetypes that go right back almost to the beginning of the Jewish people, yes?
Right, and what I argue is that there is a rabbinic perception of the Jews, not only as the concept that we're all the descendants of Jacob, but that Jacob is a meek, mild man who dwelled in tents and studied Torah according to the rabbinic maxim, unlike Esau. But what I say in the book, and I think it's a theme that runs through it, is that Jews in real life cannot simply be measured against the textual tradition of what the rabbis say about the Jews. There are Jews who have been Jacob and who have been that kind of brainiac, as you said. There are Jews who have been Esau, and there have been Jews who have been everything in between. One of the challenges of writing a book like this is to take the Jews' very rich textual tradition and then ask, yes, but what happened in real life? Have Jews lived the way the rabbis of the Talmud or later writings said they should? And of course, Jews being human beings, they live according to patterns that are not necessarily dictated by religious authorities.
How far back in history do you want to go to find the first examples of Jews who were beginning to manifest a willingness to be soldiers in an army the way we think of that today, not biblical times, but more recently?
Well, I think we'd go back really to the beginning of modern armies as such. That is, until the late 18th century, we didn't have armies where lots of young men in any particular country were drafted. Armies consisted of professional soldiers. And, you know, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, there was the occasional Jew who served in such forces. But for the most part, the story of Jews as soldiers comes with the story of conscription as such. At the time of the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, where Jews, for example, in the German lands volunteered to fight for, at that time, Prussia, against Napoleon. So really, the history of Jewish involvement in armies is as old as modern armies.
Another quote from your book: advocates for Jewish rights presented the Jewish soldier as proof that Jews were worthy of emancipation and social acceptance. A bit of a chippy question here, but it does make one wonder whether the official willingness to die was a kind of precondition for Jews being allowed out of the ghetto. Would you look at it that way?
I think that, yes, and it's part of a much larger notion that citizenship in the modern state, citizenship is dependent upon the obligation of the citizen to make sacrifices. And it's very interesting because it's tied up with masculinity, because until very recently, men were the only one's expected to fight. But of course, until well into the 20th century, women were not, in most countries in the Western world, given the full rights of citizenship. So it's a very interesting connection between the right to be a citizen and the obligation to fight and die for your country. That was an expectation made of Jews, but it was also made of others.
And let me follow up with another quote. The willingness of Jews to fight each other was heralded as the ultimate proof of worthiness for equal rights. Can you give us an example in history where Jew would have fought Jew against each other?
Well, it's hard to say that this ever really happened, but in the Jewish imagination, in poetry, in literature, in the Jewish press of the 19th and 20th century, there was a kind of specter, a fear, that at some point in battle where, say, France is fighting Germany or Russia is fighting Germany, that a Jew in the battlefield might kill another Jew. It's not that it really happened, or whether it really happened or not, that's the issue. It expresses the Jews' complicated situation, that on the one hand, they want to be accepted as Germans or French or Habsburg citizens or subjects. On the other hand, they have a Jewish solidarity which transcends borders. The most famous case is a story repeated throughout World War I of a Jew who either is about to kill another individual, an enemy in battle, or actually kills this enemy, and the other individual calls out the Shema Yisrael, the most hallowed and essential prayer or expression of Jewish obedience to God and acknowledgement of God. So there's this sense that in the moment of being about to kill someone or killing someone, that your enemy is not your enemy. Your enemy is your brother, a fellow Jew. These stories were quite common in World War I throughout Europe.
And I guess in the American Civil War, Jew would have fought against Jew, North versus South. I'm sure that happened, yes?
Yes, and there are stories of this type as well, and there are stories about families in the American South, for example, where there were 5 or 6 siblings, and some of them wound up fighting for the North, and some of them wound up fighting for the South. So wars definitely divided Jews. One rabbi in Germany in the mid-1800s called it civil wars within civil wars. So these things did happen. Whether a Jew actually killed another on the field of battle, again, is not the issue, but it's the fear and what it tells us about the complexity of Jewish patriotism and Jewish solidarity.
I guess, Derek, Israel would be at the top of the list, but what other countries would be high up on the list that Jews were most willing to die for?
Well, in general, in a country where Jews were well treated, they were more willing to serve and to fight and die than where they weren't. So in Russia, where they were persecuted, Jews in general did not look upon the army with favor. And yet even in Russia, despite all of the stories of draft dodging, which are very common to Jewish families, and of course, some Jews did dodge the draft, lots of non-Jews dodged the draft as well. Even in Russia, the overwhelming majority of Jews did go willingly to serve. Now, in Italy, where Jews were very well treated in the 1800s, or in France, where they were also very well treated until the end of the century and the time of the Dreyfus affair, Jews volunteered. They looked forward to serving, and in France and in Italy, thousands of Jews made careers as military officers. Alfred Dreyfus was actually one of the less prestigious Jewish military officers of his time. There were 20 Jewish generals during the time of the Third Republic, and there were hundreds of colonels. So he was actually somewhat lowly, being only a captain.
They remember him today, though, don't they?
They remember him today, and what I try to do in the book is tell the story not only of Dreyfus and the tragedy of his life and the anti-Semitism in the French general staff, but again, these hundreds of officers who had very good careers and who were promoted through the ranks and often had extremely demanding responsibilities. One Jewish officer was in charge of all of the fortifications in Algeria. There were other Jewish officers who were commanding gunboats in the North Atlantic or in the Gulf of Tonkin. It's a forgotten story.
Let's do one more quote from the book here. Although Jews have frequently seen the military as something to be feared and avoided at all costs, there have been many situations in which Jews have had few qualms and have even been enthusiastic about military service and the waging of war. In modern states, Jewish valor was a function of emancipation and social acceptance. When Jews felt themselves to be part of the body politic, they willingly went forth to defend it. You're not referring to it specifically here, but that sounds like a pretty apt description of Israel today. Would you agree?
Well, and that's why I say in the book that Israel represents a continuation of the diaspora by other means, because the state of Israel, after all, makes huge demands upon its citizens. And they have to sacrifice, they fight in wars, they pay very high taxes, they give a great deal to the state, and they are considered to be then full partners in the state, which is something that Jews, whether it's in Canada or in France or in tragic situations like in Germany, this is something that Jews have often wanted. And then the question is, in the state of Israel, on the one hand, the Jews have their state. They have the obligation to fight and to die for it, which, as we said earlier, most of them are willing to do. Is this something radically new, or is this a continuation or maybe a fulfillment of an aspiration that Jews have had for the last 2 centuries?
How would you characterize the quality of the Israeli/Jewish soldier in 1948 at the founding of the modern state of Israel?
Well, again, the men and women, because in 1948 we're talking about both genders, who served in 1948 were, for the most part, either new immigrants or somewhat recent immigrants or the children of immigrants. So we're not talking about people who were multi-generation Israelis, most of them. And there were some, although most of the commanders in Israel were native-born Sabras, native-born Palestinian Jews, there were some commanders who actually came from abroad, including one from Toronto, Major Ben Dunkelman, who was a commander in the Galilee in 1948 and played a major role in the war. So there were something like 3,500 volunteer fighters from South Africa, Canada, the United States, France, England, who joined with native-born or recent immigrant Israelis. So when we talk about the fighters of 1948, we don't just talk about them as Israelis. I think we talk about them as Jews, and that the 1948 war was as much a Jewish world war as it was an Israeli war.
And let me do a follow-up on that time, because I gather the biggest chunk of the Israeli officer corps at that time came from the kibbutznik movement, the socialist collective farms that Israel, of course, has been famous for and still has today. Mm-hmm. How did the ideology of that movement affect the way they soldiered?
Well, it affected it very strongly. There was a very clear connection in the kibbutz movement, really maybe until the 1980s, that the kibbutz movement produced the cream of the crop, the natural leadership of the country, that military leaders, political leaders would come from the kibbutz, that the combination of agricultural labor, pioneering, settling the land, often being the idea that the founder of the kibbutz or the founders of the kibbutz were simply heroic people. And it might be the founders themselves or their sons who would then further demonstrate their suitability to be the elite of the nation. Now, not every single commander in Israel, say in the early state, came from the kibbutz. Every now and then you had someone like Moshe Dayan, who came not from a kibbutz, but from a cooperative farm called a moshav. But you're absolutely right. A lot of them came from kibbutzim, and it was a sign of their elite status that they were to be the leaders of the armies. But this did begin to fade in the last 30 years, and now an increasing number of officers in the IDF are not from kibbutzim. In fact, very few are from kibbutzim, and they're increasingly Orthodox. About half, I think, of the command officers in the IDF now are modern Orthodox, not the ultra-Orthodox who we talked about at the beginning.
Right. Derek, I'm down to my last 30 seconds, but let me try this with you. Do you think, given the reputation that the Israel Defense Forces have today around the world, that this notion of the Jew as fearful of soldiering, no military or martial history, do you think that's finally been put to bed?
I think that most non-Jews actually don't have this idea, but I think it's one that many Jews still have. Some Jews, when I told them I was working on a book on Jews in the military, would say to me jokingly, "Oh, you're writing a book about Jews and draft dodging." That is, this idea would come from Jews much more than it would come from non-Jews. And it's really it's for both audiences, obviously, that I wrote the book.
Jews and the Military, A History by Derek J. Penslar, normally of the University of Toronto, but we've reached him today in Oxford, UK. Best of luck with your work over there, and thanks for coming on the agenda tonight, Derek. Good to see you again.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Tonight's program was produced by Wojtek Schemberg, and that is the agenda for Wednesday, October 23rd, 2013. Tomorrow, we hear it from politicians and business leaders alike. Small businesses are the bedrock of the Canadian economy, the lifeblood of our society. But challenges are aplenty. As the Business Development Bank of Canada's Small Business Week draws to a close, we'll examine what can be done to future-proof small business. Hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.